Franz Gall believed behavior, intellect, and personality might be linked to brain anatomy. Developed the doctrine of phrenology. Doctrine states that if a particular trait was well developed, then the part of the brain responsible for trait would expand, causing a bulge on the head. This doctrine generated serious research on brain functions, although it was incorrect. Pierre Flourens, first to study functions of the major sections of the brain using the technique of extirpation or ablation. Extirpation is the surgical removal of various parts of the brain and the behavioral consequences observed. Through his study, found that the brain had specific parts for specific functions and the removal of one part weakens the whole brain. William James, father of American psychology, believed in the importance to study how the mind functioned in adapting to the environment. His theories formed functionalism. Functionalism is a system of thought in psychology that studied how mental processes help individuals adapt to their environments. John Dewey produced an article that was the inception of functionalism. The article criticized the concept of the reflex arc because he believed that psychology should focus on the study of the organism as a whole as it functioned to adapt to the environment. Paul Broca examined the behavioral deficits of people with brain damage. Demonstrated that specific functional impairments can be linked with specific lesions, i.e., Broca's area. Hermann von Helmholtz, first to measure the speed of a nerve impulse. Credited with the transition of psychology into the field of the natural sciences. Sir Charles Sherrington first inferred the existence of synapses. Many of his conclusions have been proven through except for the idea that synaptic transmission was an electrical process. The synaptic transmission is a chemical process. 1.2 Organization of the human nervous system. The human nervous system is a complex web of cells that communicate, coordinate, and regulate signals for the rest of the body. Mental and physical action occurs when the body reacts to external stimuli using the nervous system. Central and peripheral nervous system. 3 kinds of nerve cells: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneuron. Sensory neurons or afferent neurons transmit sensory information from receptors to spinal cord and brain. Motor neuron or efferent neurons transmit motor information from the brain and spinal cord to muscles and glands. Interneurons, found between other neurons, are located mostly in the brain and spinal cord. They are often linked to reflex behavior or reflex arcs. Pain reflex. Step 1. Receptors detect pain. Step 2. Pain signal is transmitted by sensory neurons to spinal cord. Step 3a. Pain signals travel from sensory neuron to interneurons, of which relays pain impulses to the brain. Step 3b. Interneurons in the spinal cord send signals for muscle to withdraw from the source of pain before the brain sends muscle withdrawal signals. The nervous system is broken down into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made of 12 cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The peripheral nervous system is subdivided into somatic and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system consists of sensory and motor neurons distributed throughout the skin, joints, and muscles. These sensory neurons transmit information by afferent fibers while motor impulses travel along the efferent fibers. The autonomic nervous system regulates involuntary or non-conscious control of muscles such as heartbeat, respiration, digestion, and glandular secretions. The autonomic nervous system can regulate body temp by activating sweating or piloerection. The autonomic nervous system has 2 subdivisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. These 2 branches are antagonistic to each other. The parasympathetic nervous system's job is to conserve energy. Functions of the PNs will cause constriction of pupils, stimulation of saliva flow, constriction of bronchi, slow heartbeat, stimulation of peristalsis and secretion for digestion, stimulation of bile release, and bladder constriction. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter responsible for parasympathetic responses in the body. The sympathetic nervous system is activated by stress and closely associated with rage and fear reactions. Functions of the SNS include pupil dilation, saliva inhibition, relaxed bronchi, accelerated heartbeat, stimulation of sweating or piloerection, inhibition of peristalsis and secretion, stimulation of glucose production and release, secretion of adrenaline and noradrenaline, inhibition of bladder contraction, and orgasm stimulation. Organization of the brain. The brain is covered by the meninges or a thick sheath of connective tissue. The meninges protects the brain, anchors the brain to the skull, and reabsorbs cerebrospinal fluid. The meninges is composed of 3 layers, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Cerebrospinal fluid is the aqueous solution in which the brain and spinal cord rest. It is produced by cells that line the ventricles or internal cavities of the brain. The human brain is divided into 3 subdivisions, the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The brainstem is made up of the hindbrain and midbrain. The brainstem is the most primitive region of the brain. The forebrain, developed later, includes the limbic system. The limbic system is a group of neural structures primarily associated with emotions of aggression, fear, pleasure, and memory such as pain. The cerebral cortex is the outer covering of the cerebral hemispheres and in humans is associated with everything from language processing, problem solving, impulse control, long-term planning. Anatomical subdivisions of the brain. Hindbrain. Cerebellum refines motor movement. Medulla oblongata is vital for functioning such as breathing and digestion. Reticular formation functions in arousal and alertness. Midbrain. Inferior and superior colliculus functions in sensoromotor reflexes. Forebrain. Cerebral cortex functions include complex perceptual, cognitive, and behavioral processes. Basal ganglia helps with movement. Limbic system functions in emotion and memory. Thalamus is the sensory relay station. Hypothalamus plays a role in hunger, thirst, and emotion. Baby brain development. Brain develops from a neural tube that is composed of 3 swellings which correspond to the midbrain, hindbrain, and forebrain. Eventually mature neural tube will lead to 5 swellings. Swell 1, rhombencephalon. Gives rise to hindbrain that controls balance, motor coordination, breathing, digestion, general arousal of sleep and wake. Rhombencephalon divides to form the myelencephalon which eventually becomes medulla oblongata and the metencephalon which becomes the pons and cerebellum. The medulla oblongata is the lower brain area responsible for regulating breathing, heart rate, blood pressure. The pons contains sensory and motor pathways between the cortex and medulla. The cerebellum helps maintain posture, balance, coordination of body movement. Note that alcohol impairs cerebellum function. Swell 2, mesencephalon. Gives rise to the midbrain that receives sensory and motor information from the body and is associated with involuntary reflex triggered by visual or auditory stimuli. The midbrain includes the inferior colliculus for sensory info from the auditory system and has a reflex arc for sudden loud noises and the superior colliculus which receives visual sensory input. Swell 3, prosencephalon. Gives rise to the forebrain that is associated with complex perceptual, cognitive, and behavioral processes, emotion, memory. Note that its functions are not absolutely necessary for survival but for intellectual and emotional capacities most characteristic of humans. Prosencephalon divides to become telencephalon and diencephalon. The telencephalon eventually forms the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, and limbic system. The diencephalon eventually forms the thalamus, hypothalamus, posterior pituitary gland, and pineal gland. Methods of mapping the brain. Neuropsychology is the study of functions and behaviors associated with specific regions of the brain from a research setting where scientists attempt to associate very specific area in brain to behavior to a clinical setting where patients are treated for brain lesions. Method 1. Brain lesions have helped researchers determine the functions of the brain, but studying human brain lesions is problematic due to the fact that the damage is not isolated to specific brain structures, so lab animals are used for extirpation. Extirpation lesions can be caused by inserting tiny electrodes in the brain then applying intense cold, heat, or electricity. These electrodes provide high resolution of the brain. Method 2. Brain recordings. Using electrical stimulation, neurosurgeons can create cortical maps. This method relies on the assistance of the patient who is alert and awake. Electrodes can be used to record electrical activity produced by the brain itself. Individual neurons are recorded by inserting ultra-sensitive microelectrodes into individual brain cells, then electrical activity is recorded. Electroencephalogram or EEG is a recording of many neuronal activity from the scalp. This method is non-invasive and can be used for sleep, seizures, and brain lesions. Regional cerebral blood flow or RCBF. A non-invasive mapping procedure that detects broad patterns of neural activity based on increased blood flow to different brain parts. RCBF relies on the assumption that when a specific cognitive function activates certain regions of the brain, blood flows to those regions. To measure blood flow, patients inhale a radioactive gas and then a special device detects the radioactivity in the bloodstream to correlate radioactivity levels with regional cerebral blood flow. Other brain visualization methods. Computed tomography or CT occurs from multiple X-ray taken at different angles and processed by computer to cross-sectional slice images of the tissues. Positron emission tomography scan or PET occurs when a radioactive sugar is injected and absorbed into body, and then dispersion and uptake throughout the target tissue is imaged. MRI or magnetic resonance imaging uses a magnetic field to interact with hydrogen and map out hydrogen-dense regions of the body. fMRI or functional magnetic resonance image uses the same base technique as MRI but specifically measures changes associated with blood flow. This is useful for monitoring neural activity since increased blood flow in regions of the brain is typically coupled with neuronal activation. .4 Parts of the forebrain. The forebrain contains regions derived from the diencephalon such as thalamus, hypothalamus, posterior pituitary, and pineal gland. And also from the telencephalon such as the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, and limbic system. Thalamus is a structure in the forebrain that serves as a relay station for incoming sensory information except for smell. The thalamus takes sensory impulses to sort and transmit them to appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex. Hypothalamus is subdivided into the lateral hypothalamus, ventromedial hypothalamus, and anterior hypothalamus, serves homeostatic functions, and is a key player in emotional experiences during high arousal states, aggressive behavior, and sexual behavior. The hypothalamus also helps control some endocrine functions as well as the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus serves many homeostatic functions, which are self-regulatory processes that maintain a stable balance in the body. Lateral hypothalamus is referred to as the hunger center because it detects when the body needs more food or fluids. Lateral hypothalamus triggers eating and drinking. When the LH is destroyed, lab rats refuse to eat and drink and starve to death. Ventromedial hypothalamus is the satiety center and provides signals to stop eating. Damage to this area usually leads to obesity. Anterior hypothalamus controls sexual behavior, regulation of sleep and body temperature. Damage to this region leads to permanent inhibition of sexual activity. Other parts of the diencephalon. The diencephalon differentiates to form the posterior pituitary gland, pineal gland, and connecting pathways to other brain regions. The posterior pituitary gland receives oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone or ADH, also known as vasopressin, from the hypothalamus. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, which regulates circadian rhythms. The pineal gland receives input from the retina for coordination with sunlight. Basal ganglia coordinates muscle movement as they receive information from the cortex and relay this information to the brain and spinal cord using the extrapyramidal system. The extrapyramidal system gathers information about body position and carries this information to the CNS, but does not function directly through motor neurons. Parkinson's disease is an illness associated with the destruction of portions of the basal ganglia. Patients with Parkinson's have characterized jerky movements and uncontrolled resting tremors. Basal ganglia may play a role in OCD and schizophrenia. Limbic system is made of interconnected structures looping around the central portion of the brain to primarily serve as the emotion and memory center. Primary components of the limbic system include septal nuclei, amygdala, and hippocampus. Septal nuclei contains the primary pleasure centers in the brain. Stimulation of the septal nuclei is reported to be very pleasurable. There is an association between septal nuclei and addictive behaviors. Amygdala plays a role in defensive and aggressive behaviors that include fear and rage. When the amygdala is damaged, aggression and fear reactions are reduced. Lesions to the amygdala result in docility and hypersexual states. Hippocampus plays a role in learning and memory processing since this organ helps to consolidate information to form long-term memories, and can redistribute remote memories to the cerebral cortex. Hippocampus communicates with other portions of the limbic systems via he fornix. Patient who had anterograde amnesia. He was not able to establish new long-term memories after brain injury, but his intelligence remained relatively intact. Retrograde amnesia is the loss of memory of events that transpired before brain injury. Cerebral cortex or neocortex is the outer surface of the brain and the most recent brain region to evolve. This region contains gyri or bumps and sulci or folds, which help to increase brain surface area. The cerebral cortex is divided into two cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral cortex has four lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Frontal lobe is made of the prefrontal cortex and the motor cortex. The prefrontal cortex manages executive functions through supervising the operations of other brain regions associated with perception, memory, emotion, impulse control, and long-term planning. The prefrontal cortex also regulates attention and alertness by communicating to the reticular formation in the brainstem, telling the individual to wake up or relax. The prefrontal cortex is a good example of an association area. Association area is an area that integrates input from diverse brain regions. The opposite of association area is projection area, of which perform rudimentary or simple perceptual and motor tasks. The primary motor cortex is located on the precentral gyrus, but in front of the central sulcus that divides the frontal and parietal lobes. The primary motor cortex initiates voluntary motor control by sending neural impulses down spinal cord to muscles. The primary motor cortex is an example of a projection area. The neurons in the motor cortex are arranged systematically and can be visualized via the motor homunculus. Size of the cortex is relative to the size in the body on the homunculus. Broca's area is located on the frontal lobe to assist with speech production. Broca's area is usually found in the dominant side of the hemisphere, the left hemisphere. Parietal lobe is located behind the frontal lobe. The somatosensory cortex is located on the postcentral gyrus, behind the central sulcus, and is involved in somatosensory information processing. The somatosensory cortex receives incoming sensory signals for touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. The somatosensory cortex also has a homunculus. The central region of the parietal lobe is associated with assisting with spatial manipulation of objects, and spatial organization skills for map reading. Occipital lobe Contains the visual cortex or the striate cortex. Temporal lobe. Contains auditory cortex and Wernicke's area. The auditory cortex is the primary site of most sound processing. Wernicke's area is associated with lang reception and comprehension. Temporal lobe also functions in memory processing, emotion, and language. The hippocampus is located deep inside the temporal lobe. Cerebral hemispheres and laterality. The cerebral hemisphere can communicate both contralaterally and ipsilaterally. Contralateral means opposite side of the body. Ipsilateral means the same side of the body. Dominant hemispheres are typically defined as the hemisphere that is more heavily stimulated during language reception and production. Dominant hemisphere, usually the left, is primarily analytic in function, making it useful for managing details such as language, logic, math, language production, and language comprehension. Non-dominant hemisphere, usually the right, is associated with intuition, creativity, music cognition, and spatial processing. The non-dominant hemisphere is more sensitive to the emotional tone of spoken language and permits us to recognize others' moods based on visual and auditory cues. The dominant hemisphere screens incoming language to analyze content while the non-dominant hemisphere interprets it according to emotional tone. Remember that the left hemisphere is the dominant hemisphere in most individuals regardless of handedness. .5 Influences on behavior. Neurotransmitters, hormones in the endocrine system, heredity, and the environment influences behavior. Neurotransmitters. Some important neurotransmitters to remember include acetylcholine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, GABA, glycine, glutamate, and peptide neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is found in the CNS and PNs. In the PNs, acetylcholine is used to transmit nerve impulses to the muscles of both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. In the CNS, acetylcholine is linked to attention and arousal. The loss of cholinergic neuron contention with the hippocampus is associated with Alzheimer's disease. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine are catecholamines, monoamines, and biogenic amines. Catecholamines play important roles in the experience of emotion. Epinephrine or adrenaline and norepinephrine or noradrenaline play a role in controlling alertness and wakefulness. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are the primary neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system to promote fight or flight response. Norepinephrine commonly acts at a local level while epinephrine is often secreted from the adrenal medulla to act systemically as a hormone. Low levels of norepinephrine is associated with depression while high levels are associated with anxiety and mania. Dopamine plays a role in movement and posture. High concentrations of dopamine are found in the basal ganglia, which helps to smooth movement and maintain postural stability. Imbalances in dopamine transmission play a role in schizophrenia. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia states that delusions, hallucinations, and agitation associated with schizophrenia arise from too much dopamine or an oversensitivity to dopamine in the brain. This hypothesis does not account for all findings of the disease. Parkinson's disease is associated with a loss of dopaminergic neurons in the basal ganglia. Serotonin plays a role in regulating mood, eating, sleeping, dreaming, depression, and mania. Too much serotonin produces manic states while too little serotonin produces depression. GABA or gamma-aminobutyric acid produces inhibitory postsynaptic potentials and is thought to play a role in stabilizing neural activity in the brain. GABA causes hyperpolarization of the postsynaptic membrane. Glycine, one of the 20 proteinogenic amino acids, serves as an inhibitory neurotransmitter in the CNS by increasing chloride influx to neurons. Glutamate, one of the 20 proteinogenic amino acids, acts as an excitatory neurotransmitter in the CNS. Peptide neurotransmitters. Neuromodulators or neuropeptides assist in a complicated chain of events in the postsynaptic cell. They are relatively slow and have longer effects on postsynaptic cells than neurotransmitters. For example, endorphins are natural painkillers produced in the brain that have actions similar to morphine or other opioids in the body. Endocrine system uses chemical messengers called hormones. The endocrine system is slower than the nervous system because hormones travel to target destinations through the bloodstream. The hypothalamus links endocrine and nervous systems and regulates the hormonal function of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus and pituitary gland are spatially close to each other and control is maintained through endocrine release of hormones into the hypophyseal portal system that directly connects the two organs. The pituitary gland is made of the anterior and posterior parts. The anterior pituitary releases hormones that regulate activities of the endocrine glands. The anterior pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. The hormones released by the anterior pituitary gland travel in the bloodstream to other endocrine glands. The endocrine gland then manufactures and secretes its own characteristic hormone into the bloodstream. Adrenal gland is made up of the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine as part of the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex produces testosterone, estrogen, and corticosteroids such as cortisol. Gonads are sex glands in the body. Females have ovaries and males have testes. The gonads produce high concentrations of sex hormones, leading to increased levels of testosterone in males and increased levels of estrogen in females. The sex hormones increase libido and contribute to mating behavior and sexual function. High levels of testosterone also increase aggressive behavior. Genetics and behavior. Behavioral and physical traits can be inherited from patients. Innate behavior is genetically programmed as a result of evolution and seen in all individuals regardless of environment or experience. Learned behaviors are not hereditary based but are learned through experience and the environment. Adaptive value is the extent to which a trait or behavior positively benefits a species by influencing the evolutionary fitness of the species to lead to adaptation via natural selection. Nature is defined as heredity or the influence of inherited characteristics on behavior. Nurture is the influence of the environment and physical surroundings on behavior. A mixture of nature and nurture influence behavior. It is possible for particular environmental factors to influence genetic factors in development of a specific trait. Researchers are able to determine the degree of genetic influence on individual differences between people using the methods of family studies, twin studies, and adoption studies. Family studies rely on the assumption that genetically related individuals are more similar genotypically than unrelated individuals. Family studies are limited because families share both genetics and environment. Family studies cannot distinguish shared environmental factors from genetic factors. Twin studies are useful in distinguishing relative effects of shared environment and genetics by comparing the concordance rates for a trait between monozygotic or identical and dizygotic or fraternal twins. Concordance rate is the likelihood that both twins exhibit the same trait. Monozygotic twins are genetically identical while dizygotic twins are 50% identical. The assumption is that both monozygotic and dizygotic twins share the same environment, so differences between twins are thought to reflect heredity. This assumption is flawed. To better measure genetic effects relative to the environment, researchers compare traits in twins raised together to twins raised apart. They found that monozygotic twins raised in separate families were more similar than dizygotic twins raised together. This supports a strong genetic component to personality. Adoption studies help us understand environmental influences and genetic influence on behavior. This study compares the similarities between biological relatives and the adopted child to similarities between adoptive relatives and adoptive children. An IQ study found that adopted children are more similar to biological parents than adopted parents. 1.6 Development. Development begins at the moment of conception. Physiological changes are rapid from embryonic to fetal stages into infancy. Children exhibit consistent patterns of motor abilities and physiological changes based on age. Prenatal stage. The development of the nervous system starts with neurulation at 3 to 4 weeks gestational age. Neurulation occurs when the ectoderm overlying the notochord begins to furrow, forming a neural groove surrounded by two neural folds. Neural crest are cells at the leading edge of the neural fold. The neural crest cells will migrate throughout the body to form disparate tissues, dorsal root ganglia, melanocytes, and calcitonin-producing cells of the thyroid. The rest of the furrow forms the neural tube. The neural tube will eventually form the CNS. The neural tube has an alar plate and basal plate. Alar plate differentiates into sensory neurons. Basal plate differentiates into motor neurons. The neural tube will invaginate and fold on itself many times to begin the embryonic brains of three swellings. The three swellings are prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. The three swellings become 5 swellings as the brain becomes mature. The 5 swellings are the telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon. During prenatal development, the mother's interest helps to balance the chemical, environment, temperature, orientation of the fetus with respect to gravity, and atmospheric pressure. The fetus is attached to the uterine wall and placenta by the umbilical cord. The placenta transmit food, oxygen, and water to the fetus while returning water and waste to the mother. Maternal blood supplies many of the proteins and amino acids needed for growth, although eventually the embryo begins to produce these things too. Problems during development. External influences can have deleterious effects on the development of the fetus. Virus and bacteria can cross the placenta and cause damage to the developing fetus. Rubella causes cataracts, deafness, heart defects, and intellectual disability to the child. Measles, mumps, hepatitis, influenza, varicella, and herpes are also linked to birth defects. Some pharmaceutical development can help the mother but harm the fetus. For example, thalidomide used to reduce morning sickness in moms caused babies to be birthed with missing and malformed limbs, defects of the heart, eyes, ears, digestive tracts. Antiepileptic medications are associated with neural tube defects that cause the tube to close completely, leading to spina bifida or anencephaly. Environmental factors and exposures can affect maturation. For example, maternal malnutrition is the leading cause of abnormal development. Protein deficiency causes slow growth that can lead to intellectual disability, reduced immunity to disease. Maternal narcotic addiction produces chemically dependent infants who must undergo severe withdrawal after birth. Cigarette smoke leads to slowed growth, increased fetal heart rate, and a greater chance of premature birth. Alcohol leads to slow physical and psychological growth. X-ray exposure is strongly linked to retardation, defects of the skull, spinal cord, eyes, cleft palate, and limb deformities. Motor development. Infants are born with well-developed somatic structures and a broad array of reflexes that ensure survival. Reflex is a behavior that occurs in response to a given stimulus without higher cognitive input. Infants have primitive reflexes that disappear with age. For example, the rooting reflex is the automatic turning of the head in the direction of the stimulus that touches the cheek. Swallowing and sucking when an object is placed in the mouth are also other reflexes. Other primitive reflexes serve an adaptive purpose in early stages of human evolution, but are used in assessing infant neurological development. Comparing the point in time at which these reflexes disappear relative to the established norms makes it possible to know whether neurological development is taking place in a normal fashion. The Moro reflex is the infant's ability to react to abrupt movements of their heads, flinging arms out, then slowly retracting their arms, and crying usually disappears after 4 months. If the Moro reflex continues for 1 year, it is a strong suggestion of developmental difficulties. Asymmetry of the Moro reflex may hint at underlying neuromuscular problems. The Babinski reflex causes the toes to spread apart automatically when the sole of the foot is stimulated. The grasping reflex occurs when the infant closes fingers around objects placed in hand. Adults with neurological disease may exhibit these primitive reflexes, especially in illnesses that cause demyelination. Besides reflexes, newborn infants can kick, turn, and wave their arms. These uncoordinated and unconnected behaviors form the basis for more coordinated movements in the future. Infants typically develop motor skills around the same time in the same order. This suggests an innately programmed ability for human babies. Adding educational richness to the environment will affect the rate of learning to promote quicker development. Motor skills include both gross and fine motor skills. Gross motor skills incorporate movement from large muscle groups and whole body motions such as crawling and walking. Fine motor skills involve the smaller muscle of the fingers, toes, eyes, to provide more specific and delicate movements such as drawing, waving, catching. Social development. Social development occurs in infancy and through adolescence. Stranger anxiety is the fear and apprehension of unfamiliar individuals. Separation anxiety is the fear of being separated from the parental figure. Both anxieties develop approximately 7 months and 1 year respectively. During this time, play style progresses from solitary to onlooker. At 2 years, the child develops parallel play. Parallel play is playing alongside each other without influencing each other's behavior. At age 3, a child has awareness of his or her gender identity, engages in sex-type play, and knows his or her full name. At age 5, children begin to conform to peers and can have romantic feelings development. From ages 6 to 12, a child's friend circles tend to be same-sex without expression of romantic feelings. In teenage years, children become more self-sufficient, express their desire for independence, and cross-gender friendships become more common. Individuals also become more aware of their sexual orientation and sexual relationships begin. Most children fall within plus or minus 2 months of the developmental milestones. Try to recognize the themes of development.